You can share your screen, or I can share, but I'm on the phone. It's going to be a little weird.
Okay, let me see. I have to just pull the verse up then.
You don't have to. You can just read. That's fine.
Okay, just read it. Okay, sounds good. Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we're reading from Srimad Bhagavatam 10th canto, the first verse, 15th, sorry, the first chapter, 15th verse, just right in the beginning of the 10th canto. And I will repeat the verse, and you can pull it up if you'd like on your screen as well, or on your computer. So this section is the section where we're speaking about Krishna. And Parikshit Maharaj is asking Shukadev Goswami, can you please tell me about Vasudev? And Shukadev Goswami is replying in so many kind ways to Parikshit Maharaj. Shri Shuka Vacha Samyag Vaishvishista Buddhis Tava Rajashri Satama Vasudeva Katham Yamte Yajata Naishtiki Rati. So this is the Sanskrit. Translation. Srila Shukadev Goswami said, O your Majesty, best of all saintly kings, because you are greatly attracted to topics of Vasudeva, it is certain your intelligence is firmly fixed in spiritual understanding, which is the only true goal for humanity. Because that attraction is unceasing, it is certainly sublime. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Krishna Katha is, and I really like this purport actually, so we'll dive right into it. Krishna Katha is compulsory for the Rajrishi, or the executive head of government. This is also mentioned in Bhagavad Gita, Imam Rajasayo Vidu, which is Gita 4.2. Unfortunately, however, in this age, the governmental power is gradually being captured by third class and fourth class men who have no spiritual understanding, and society is therefore very quickly becoming degraded. Krishna Katha must be understood by the executive heads of government, for otherwise, how will people be happy and gain relief from the pangs of materialistic life? One has fixed his mind in Krishna consciousness should be understood to have a very sharp intelligence in regards to the value of life. Maharaj Parikshit was Rajarshi Satama, the best of all saintly kings, and Shukadev Goswami was Muni Satama, the best of munis. Both of them were elevated because of their common interest in Krishna Katha. The exalted position of the speaker and the audience will be explained very nicely in the next verse. Krishna Katha is so enlivening that Maharaj Parikshit forgot everything material, even his personal comfort in relation to food and drink. This is an example of how the Krishna consciousness movement should spread all over the world to bring both the speaker and the audience on the transcendental platform and back home, back to Godhead. Haribo. Okay. Om Agyantimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtai Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadada Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. So I'll read the translation one more time. Srila Shukadev Goswami said, O your Majesty, best of all saintly kings, because you are greatly attracted to topics of Vasudeva, it is certain that your intelligence is firmly fixed in spiritual understanding, which is the only true goal for humanity. Because that attraction is unceasing, it is certainly sublime. Okay, cool. So thank you all for being here. And for those of you on video, definitely appreciate that. Let's go right into it because we have limited time. And I'd like to speak on some of the points that Srila Prabhupada mentioned in the purport because I think they're very important, and also from the translation. So this section, as mentioned, is Sukadeva Goswami speaking to Maharaj Parikshit. And this verse is very powerful because, for me at least, especially as Anand Bihari Prabhu mentioned, yes, this is Canto 10, first chapter, 15th verse. But as he mentioned, I do leadership coaching work, and so I get to study how leaders are. And we get to look at Shastra, and we can also look at modern leaders and the modern world and compare. And Prabhupada makes a very important point, which I'd like to talk about and spend this topic in, is really on leadership and some of the qualities of a leader, and how Parikshit Maharaj embodies many of those qualities, and how we can also improve ourselves to embody some of those, recognizing where we do and also recognizing where we don't. So I want to keep it very practical, and hopefully you'll find that, and I'd love to open it up for any questions or comments at the end, because I think that this topic is so important, and I'd like to come to it from a self-improvement perspective in developing our Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada makes a point that leadership is very important, basically. And he says that Krishna Katha is compulsory for the executive head of the government. And what he's saying there is that leadership is very important. And ultimately, leaders actually set the culture wherever they are, right? Whether it's leaders in the modern world or in our spiritual organizations, our companies, they set the culture. And I liken it very much to when there's a good leader, it's like swimming downstream. It's a lot easier to do things, right? Because there's an encouragement that's flowing, there's resources, there's energy that's flowing in that way. Versus when the leadership is not so supportive, or is corrupt maybe even, it's like swimming upstream. It can be very, very challenging to move forward, right? You have to expend a lot of resources, a lot of energy, and it's not very conducive toward moving forward. And in the Gita, it's also said in the 3rd chapter, Krishna says in 3rd chapter, 21st verse, that whatever actions performed by a great man, common men follow in their footsteps, in his or her footsteps. And whatever standard he or she sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. So we know that when Krishna is saying that leaders are visible, they're being followed, right? And so in many ways today, I feel like we have a leadership crisis in the world in a lot of ways. And we look at the news, we look at the political situation, whether not going on either side of the coin or even in the middle, but just speaking to the general lack of mature spiritual leadership, which we'll be talking about. What does that even constitute? But there's definitely a lack today. And I think it really begs the question, what is real leadership? And what qualities make up a leader? So those are some of the things I wanted to mention just to set the stage. And really, Shukadeva Goswami is mentioning here that, and I really like it in the translation, this really caught my eye when I was first looking at this verse, that a real leader is fixed in spiritual understanding. He's appreciating Maharaj Parikshit for that you're fixed in spiritual understanding. But what does that even mean? Sometimes our spiritual concepts can feel like intellectual ideals versus practical experiences, because we haven't applied them, or we're still figuring out how to apply them. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And in terms of what he means by that, I'd like to go in a couple ways. And one is really examining the qualities of a leader, and examining qualities of an advanced Vaishnava and devotee, which is something that we all are striving for. In the 13th chapter of the Gita, it's one of my favorite sections of the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna, he asks many questions, and one question he asks is to Krishna is, what is knowledge? It says in the beginning of the 13th chapter, what is true knowledge? And one thing I find very interesting, which I'd like to be speaking about today, is that Krishna doesn't respond by saying one who has read all the 4 Vedas is someone who is in true knowledge, or one who has performed so many sacrifices and pujas, he is of true knowledge. Interestingly, Krishna responds in the 8th verse or the 12th verse with a list of qualities. Yes, Yamana Jayaprabhu, it's one of my favorites as well. And he responds with a list of qualities, and it's like anywhere from 10 to 20 qualities that he's speaking about. And what he's saying there is that, what I really took from that is that true knowledge is actually behavior. It's actually mature behavior. And our knowledge that we have in terms of all the book knowledge that we've gained and the intellectual knowledge we've gained in this life is of value, but it's only of value as much as it's embodied in wisdom, in our behavior, in our heart, and through all of our actions and our dealings with others and with ourselves. And so we have jnana and we have vijnana. Jnana is knowledge, and we have vijnana, which is really realized knowledge. It's embodied knowledge. And so that's really, really important to know. As there's a leadership coach, Tony Robbins, he's quite well known. He says often that people say knowledge is power, but knowledge is only potential power. So it's how you use it. How are you using it? Because there's so many people that know so much, but know so little in some ways. We all have gotten into that trap. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, but also what's interesting is that the first quality Krishna mentions in his response to Arjuna is humility, actually. Humility. When Arjuna asks, what is knowledge? Krishna responds with, the first word is amanitvam, which means humility. And what I really take that as is that Krishna is saying that real knowledge, humility is the foundation of all good qualities, actually. And it's the foundation of a great leader. And it's interesting, even the modern research and leadership theories and coaches are catching up to this, that it's so important to be humble. And what does humility mean, though? Right? When we talk about humility, I like to clear up some conceptions with it, because I've struggled with this concept of humility. Sometimes as devotees, I think that and practicing spiritualists, we view humility in a way of not speaking about ourselves, not sharing with other people what we're doing, all the great things that we're doing, and really holding sort of that close to our heart almost. Or not even maybe being passive, not being assertive, etc. But actually, so the word humility comes from the Latin word, which is humus, or humus. I don't know exactly how to say it, but it means earth or soil, and actually means the ground. So it's when we feel like something is grounded, actually. So it comes from this Latin word, and I thought it was very interesting that it means grounded, and it means earth and soil, because when we think about someone who's grounded, think about when we say how that individual is so grounded, such a grounded individual. What we're really saying is that they're really in touch with reality. They're very grounded with who they are. They're in touch with reality. They're not too high or too low. So I think that sometimes we have a skewed version of what humility is, but humility is really, it's really about being in touch with who we are and being very real with who we are, both the highs and the lows. Right? The ego's trap is either we're everything, we're the controller, we're the best, we're the most special, we're the most significant, etc., or we're the worst. Right? We're very critical on ourselves, we're beating ourselves up, we're not enough, etc. And those are two sides of actually the same coin of the ego, the false ego. Because we're falsely identifying. We're not actually really identifying with who we really are. We're kind of getting lost in the ahankar, or the illusion of I, of the false sense of self. But actually, real humility is, and I want to make this point really clear, because sometimes I feel like we misunderstand. I've misunderstood it for many years. Humility is really about being confident in oneself, but also so knowing that we're deeply significant and we're gifted by Krishna in so many ways, but at the same time holding that juxtaposition that we're also one of many, and there's many other people who are talented, significant, and we're part of the whole. We're part and parcel of Krishna. So real humility is being confident in who we are, but then also being able to see that there's so many other people in the world as well who are very good at what they do. So being able to hold our significance and insignificance both at one time, and being confident with who we are. And contrary to maybe popular belief, it doesn't mean that we can't be assertive or confident. And also, it doesn't mean that we have low self-esteem, right? We're also able to be confident enough to see our weaknesses, to see our strengths, and to see the whole picture of us in a very grounded way. Sometimes we get too lost in one frame of our picture versus the whole picture. So I wanted to share that, just kind of setting up and just to briefly recap where we're at. We talked about the introduction, just really Shukadev Swami setting the stage, saying spiritual understanding. So a leader is one who has spiritual understanding. What does that even mean? How important leadership is, because leaders impact everything we do in our life, right? And we are all leaders in our own ways, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then, but we're talking about what are some of the qualities of leaders, and that we can all embody, because we're all leaders in our families, communities, and societies. And we talked about humility being one of the chief most, and how mature behavior comes through actual embodied knowledge, not just what we know. Okay, so that I wanted to stop there, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, and briefly, about Maharaj Parikshit and how he embodied some of these qualities, and also what sort of the difference between ego-based leadership and spiritual leadership, right? So we talked about ego and we talked about humility, but how do we look at them and how do they play out into the world? How do they play out in interaction? So I wanted to share, if you're with me, just give me a little nod, because it's only a few of you are on video. Give me a little thumbs up if you can. Okay, good. Great, everyone's following along, okay. Because I'm just want to make sure that it's good. Okay, thank you, Ambika, as well. So I wanted to share this right here, and it's something I made. Let me know if you can see it. Can everyone see this? Okay, awesome. So I just made this as I was prepping for this talk. I just thought, hey, you know what? There's such a big difference between ego-based leadership and spiritual leadership. And I'd like to talk about that. So we talked about humility, and I'd like to go through this in brief. And I hope it's very, very valuable for all of us. And as we go through this, I'd like for all of us to really think about how this applies to us. Because we're not totally spiritual all the time in terms of our behavior, and we're not totally in our ego all the time, right? We're sort of in the mix when we're going through life, right? Generally speaking. And so can everyone see this, by the way? Yes? Okay, cool. So we're generally in the spectrum of being, right? Sometimes we act out from our ego, a place of ego, and sometimes we're in our core self, and really in our heart space. And so looking at ourselves and seeing where do we show up and how do we improve is going to be the key here. So one of the things that, in terms of the goal for spiritual leaders versus ego-based leadership, for spiritual-based leadership, the goal in anything is meaningful connection and growth for all involved. Others, ourselves, our organizations, and our world. We're always thinking about a win-win situation. And for folks when we're in that ego-based place, we're in a self-focus. We're always thinking about our own development, our own movement forward, our own maybe career progression or whatnot. Not that it's bad, but we're focused exclusively almost on that, really. Now this is interesting, relationship to power, right? Relationship to power. When we have a spiritual leader who has a spiritual understanding, as Shukadev Goswami mentions, there's a sense of stewardship and service. And this is very, very important. It's a principle of karma yoga. It's so important to know that whatever role we have, real leaders and mature leaders know that the role they have is really a role that's been given to them in rent. Meaning that they're there for a certain period, and there's someone before them, and someone will be someone after them. And their job is really one of being a steward for what they're doing, to do the best job they can and be of service, but also try to leave things in a better state than they came. And we see this with Maharaj Parikshit, where he finds out that he's going to pass away. This is actually how the Bhagavatam, as you all know, is set. The stage is set where he's cursed by a Brahmana's son, and he finds out he has 7 days to live. And we look at Maharaj Parikshit's response. He's not really saying, when he heard the news, he didn't necessarily say, "Oh my God, I'm the emperor of the world," right? He's one of the biggest leaders of that time, the biggest leader in that time, and he's the grandson of Arjuna. And he's not saying, "Wow, I can't leave this position. How could I do this? This is so unfair that I'm cursed." But he actually humbly accepts his fate, and he's a steward. He makes sure the affairs of the kingdom are in order, and then he makes sure that he does what's best for him and for the kingdom, in terms of actually sitting down with the sages and actually learning the Srimad Bhagavatam. And so this stewardship is so important. And when we're in an ego-based leadership model, there's a sense of it's authority-based and command and control. So we're focusing on maintaining power and status even in subtle ways, right? So that's something that's key. When we talk about qualities, we're looking at qualities like empathy, compassion, curiosity, vulnerability, courage, humility, flexibility, transparency. Versus when we're in an ego-based model, it's authoritative, it's critical, inflexible, rigid, closed off. Thinking level, this is very key. When we're in a model of being spiritually based and heart-centered, we are as inclusive as possible of other people, and we see things in context, in shades of gray. Nothing is black or white in this world, actually. And so we're able to really be flexible with others. And we view others as unique individuals with unique talents and needs. Versus when we're in an ego-based leadership, we're generally in a black or white situation. We think in a black or white way. Either it's this or that. It's very limiting. In terms of focus, we look at focus. In a spiritual-based leadership model, we encourage others, and the focus is really on encouraging others and fostering a culture of appreciation. And this doesn't mean that we don't hold people accountable. We hold people accountable when required, but we're really trying to encourage others. We're trying to encourage others. Versus in an ego-based model, there's a focus on mistakes and improvements. Right? We've all had that person in our life, just nod your head if you agree, where either a boss or someone, maybe a friend or family member, where it just feels like whatever we're doing, we can't do it right for them. Like there's always something that's wrong, or they're always focusing on our mistakes, our improvements. And that's really that ego-based leadership model where we're focusing on that versus actually focusing on the appreciation, but also holding folks accountable as needed. And one big thing here I wanted to mention that's different in terms of our focus is folks in a leadership, spiritual leadership-based model are very open to different perspectives, and they focus on learning from their constituents to help improve the experience for everyone. And they inspire respect because of this. So they have enough confidence and humility, going back to that point of humility, to be able to be open to other perspectives that might even challenge or differ from their perspective. Versus others, when we're in our ego, we're focused on self-protection. We're afraid to honestly hear what other people have to say candidly because they might challenge or differ from our perspectives, and we become very defensive. We know that we're in our ego when we're becoming very defensive and not really being open to what others have to say. And instead of inspiring respect, when we're going from this ego-based place, we're desiring and trying to command respect from others. And it usually doesn't work out so well for us, generally. And we can look at the mantra. I won't go through all of this because we're limited on time. And then we also, just from a brief perspective, the mantra of someone who's really trying to be a spiritually based leader is always trying to help everyone else win and help themselves win, creating a win-win. Versus in our ego, we're focused on our winning. If other people win, that's great, right? A lot of companies can be even viewed from this angle where it's all about their profit, and if things happen for the world, it's good. If things don't happen, that's okay too. They just want to make sure they're focused on themselves, and that's a very limited view. We have the modes of the gunas, the modes of nature. We have goodness and pure goodness, and then also rajas and tamas, which I'll let you all just place that. I'm sure you all are familiar with the modes. We can talk a little bit more about that too. And really the results here. It's interesting. In ego-based leadership, you can actually get a lot done. Believe it or not. It's not all wrong. And I don't mean to come here and say that our ego is bad, right? It's actually trying to protect us in a lot of ways. But it's not very helpful, actually, long term, in terms of our spiritual growth at all. It's part of the human experience, but it's not so helpful. And so being in this place, we get mixed results. There can be many good results or many things can get done, but generally it's done at the expense of people, right? Expense of relationships. And what we generally find is there's low levels of trust, team satisfaction, and loyalty, high turnover, and there's a sense of being stuck in survival mode. Versus when there's a spiritually based leadership model, It's inspiring and visionary, and it leaves a legacy of possibility, opportunity, and growth that fosters trust, satisfaction, and loyalty. People really feel inspired, and it creates a high trust environment because people feel safe being themselves. They feel encouraged for who they are. They know they can speak up and be who they are and share their concerns because the leaders can hear them. And we see that with many different leaders in the ancient Vedic paradigm, and Maharaj Parikshit being one of them, as mentioned. So I just wanted to share that with you, all of you. I created this little slide there to kind of help juxtapose both of those. And like I mentioned, we're not purely on one side or the other, right? When we might be in a spiritually based model, we might be feeling really grounded and centered, and then we get really triggered by someone and lash out and say something, right? And so we have to really monitor ourselves, and I don't want to put us down for any of these behaviors, because we all can sometimes have these behaviors. But how do we improve and grow, and how do we become aware of where we are? Okay, so I'll start to wrap up. I know we have just a few minutes. So I wanted to share, again, how important leadership was, the qualities of humility and spiritually based leaders versus when we're coming from a place of ego. And a couple more points I wanted to make on leadership as I just wrap up is that mature spiritual leaders, when we talk about mature spiritual leaders, there's a sense of, when we talk about spiritual understanding, there's also a sense of understanding that their humility and their gifts, their humility really comes from understanding that things come from Krishna, and that their talents and their gifts are given to them by Krishna in service of others, basically. And that's also another element of spiritual understanding, because they have this humility that Krishna's given me all this knowledge or this talent, and how can I use it? And also mature leaders, they really provide. One thing I also want to mention is they provide, and we can all think about this in our life, we provide for not just the spiritual needs, but the bodily and emotional needs of other people as well, right? And for our needs. Sometimes we have a tendency to focus spiritually, which is very important, but also it's really important, and we know in the pandemic also, to take care of our emotional needs, right? Taking care of our mental health, our body as well, is very important. So that's also a really important point here. Being able to take care of all levels, right? We know Maslow's hierarchy, which is a psychologist, Abraham Maslow, from the 1950s. He talks about how our lower needs need to be met. So physiological and safety needs, security needs, before we can actually self-actualize. Many other needs need to be met. And it's different for each person, and sometimes we're working on different levels at the same time, but we do need to have those needs met in general. So it's very important. And one point I did want to mention, this is a very interesting point, that, and I heard this from a devotee in a class that they were giving. It was a very nice point, I want to mention it, that power and humility also have a little dynamic. Power and humility. Meaning that whenever, it's really important to whatever level of power you have, that we're given by Krishna in this life, that we have enough humility for that actual power that we're given. And what we find is that there's an imbalance that happens if the power that we're given is greater than the humility that we actually have in our character. You'll find a tip. There'll be a tip in terms of the balance will be shifted, right? And there'll be a slip up and etc. And those slip ups happen, but it can be much stronger. And you see that across history, where leaders are given a certain amount of power, they rise to power, etc. But their heart is not very clean, perhaps, and they haven't really cultivated that humility. And so instead of serving the folks that they're trying to serve, they end up creating more harm than good, actually, in their leadership position. And we find that across history, where it becomes so self-serving, and even just for the ego of one individual, the whole society is destroyed, right? And the whole civilization is destroyed just because of one person's ego, their bruised ego and their wounded ego. Right, so that's very sad, and we see that also sometimes in the modern world too. Maybe not to that extent that we used to see in times before, but also it does happen in organizations where one person's ego can just drag the whole situation down, become very toxic. So it's very important. There's a really sensitive dynamic between power and humility, and so that's why cultivating humility is very, very important, because that way, when we don't let the power get to our head, right, that we're having, or given by Krishna, we're actually able to manage it and still be open to serving others and to be open to their perspective. So those are some thoughts on leadership. And I'd like to leave you all with a few thoughts. And some people might ask, is this shift possible? Is it possible to get into a spiritually based leadership model? I think so. And I'm personally seeing more companies now when I work with some of these companies, and folks, I think folks are really looking. There's been definitely a shift, and people are definitely looking for workplaces, organizations, even spiritual communities and sanghas that are really based in this model, that are really based in openness, encouragement, appreciation, really being seen for who they are and what they bring to the table. And so there's definitely been a shift, especially in the last 10, 15 years. I've seen significant strides in this, and let's pray it moves forward. And I'd like to leave you with 3 thoughts in terms of what can we do. So we talked about many of these things. 3 brief thoughts. We might say this and say, hey, I'm not a leader. I'm not a big, I don't mind politics, or I'm not a big director or executive at a company. But I'd really argue, and this is probably one of the more important points, that I feel that we're all leaders, actually. We're all leaders when we are, any interaction we have with someone, we're actually influencing them. We're influencing them in some way or another. And there's a nice quote by Radhanath Swami. I think he was quoting someone else. I heard him say this in the class. He says that at every moment, you should be preaching. And once in a while, say something. Right? At every moment, you should be preaching, but once in a while, say something. And I really like this point because it, again, going back to that point, behavior. What's our behavior? How are we interacting with others? And so, whether it's our family, our friends, our spouse, there's a reason we call it Grihastha Ashram, right? Because it's an ashram. When we talk about our family, we talk about our friends, we talk about our spiritual community. How do we really show up in a way that is our highest core self? And how are we impacting others, because we're leaders in every which way in our communities. Even if we're not given the title, we're leaders in our communities and in our families. So I would say 3 things. One is introspection is really needed. If there's 3 things that we can walk away with. Introspection. Sometimes we want to focus on our sadhana and chanting our rounds, and that means our puja or chanting our rounds. That's super important. I would like to add the one component of that is really this introspection, self-reflection being really, really important. And I'm sure all of you do this already, but I just wanted to hit on this point because when we're talking about this ego-based leadership or spiritually based servant leadership model, really the impediment to it, what we talked about, is the ego, and the stage of bhakti that really is clearing that is anartha nirvritti. Right? We have these anarthas, which is unwanted conditioning, and we need to actually purify these things in the heart, right? So this is very, very important. And so it takes real courage to be introspective and honest with ourselves in terms of the areas we have to improve and the parts of our life that we have to improve on. And so that's something that's really important. I would say introspection and really bringing that into our sadhana as well. In addition to our chanting, in addition to our meditation and different practices in our sangha, is bringing this deep reflection, introspection on even the parts of us that we don't want to see, that we've been really hiding away and not really wanting to deal with, because that's actually part of our spiritual growth. And that's actually one of the biggest ways we'll actually spiritually grow, is when we work through that side. And it's not just about how many rounds we chant and how much service we do. That's really important, but it's also about how we're working through these things and how we're becoming a better Vaishnava in that regard. Second thing is, in this introspection, really important to get help. It's hard to also, this is why we have Guru Sadhu Shastra in our community, because it's also hard to also see our own blind spots, right? It's hard to see because we're in our own mind and body. Sometimes it's hard to see where are we deficient. And so it's beautiful. You see this model here even with Parikshit Maharaj and Shukadev Goswami. Every king in the ancient times had brahmanas, a team of brahmanas who were advisors, who would help them make these decisions. It wasn't just the king would think, or etc. The leadership would think, that I'm just going to make this decision, and it's just my decision, and I don't need to consult anyone ever. And but there's actually advisors, and these advisors would help them see blind spots, potential ramifications and consequences, etc., to make the thinking more whole. And so it's very important to get help, and really having people who are the main ingredients for that are people who are wise, who are experienced in the path that we like to walk through, but also who are genuine well wishers, right? They need to be genuine well wishers, because there's many mentors and advice givers, but many of them also are not so wise or experienced sometimes, or especially in the area you need. But also sometimes they may not be genuine well wishers of yours, and so it's very, very important to find someone who has proven that trust over time. So really having those qualities. And third thing I was going to say, so introspection, getting help, and then being a light where we are. We're all, I like this phrase, that we're all sort of kings and queens of our own lives, right? We may not be kings and queens in the world, etc., but we're definitely have our own kingdom, which is our lives. Like I mentioned, the people that we interact with on a daily basis, and how can we be a light in that, and how can we show up in this way and continue to develop. Like I said, we all have these blind spots, continue to develop so we can show up in a more holistic way. And that's where I want to leave everyone at. There's a nice thing. Jiva Goswami said that there's two things needed to go back to Godhead: attentive chanting and attentive dealings with the Vaishnavas and with others. So both are important, actually. So attentive chanting and attentive dealing. So are we doing both of them? So with that, I'd like to open it up. I know we talked about a lot of different things, whether it's spiritual-based leadership. We talked about humility, the ego, why leaders are so important, what the differences are between the two, and a little bit about what we can do about that and working on our own anarthas. Yes?
Thank you, Anuj Prabhu. Jamuna Jaya, unmute yourself. Unmute your smile.
I'm chomping at the bit because I always have to run away. But
yeah.
Okay, first of all, I'm emailing Bhakti Center leadership right now because this needs to be like a 3-hour workshop. So that's one. So I'd be expecting a call from Doyle, Garanga, and Kishore because this, I couldn't, I'm going to watch this like 15 times. So thank you for all of that jam packing in. I love it. Yeah, Emily just put in the book, attentive chanting, attentive dealings. Thank you so much. I did have one quick question. When you said our ego protects us, I was a little bewildered by that because normally, as the Gita says, usually my ego is my worst friend. So I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. And I would love to do more of this, by the way. So thank you for that too. What I mean by that is that it's long-term very detrimental to us. What I'm trying to say is that when we feel defensive, when we're lashing out, etc., at others, when we're in our place of ego, there's actually other feelings underneath that is trying to protect us from. So there are feelings of maybe shame or insecurity, other things that are coming up for us that we're actually not maybe even conscious of, right? So what I mean by that is, and I think I was listening to something by Radhanath Swami, he was mentioning that actually underneath, we think that when someone's very arrogant, they might be very confident or something like that. Underneath that is actually a lot of low self-esteem. And I know in my own life, and I can raise my hand, when I've been arrogant or I felt in that state, I can look back and say, man, I probably did feel insecure, right? And so it's trying to protect. What I mean when I say protect, I don't mean protect us in a positive way. I mean protect us from those feelings that we actually need to feel and understand and get comfortable with more and actually deal with. Long term, it's very detrimental. It can be detrimental to our relationships and to our spiritual growth, absolutely, and it is. But I think writing it, what I'm trying to also do is not write it off immediately, because sometimes we write it off as totally bad, when actually underneath that might be things that really have to be worked at and looked at with curiosity and empathy versus judgment.
Thank you. Got it. Thank you so much. Yes, and again, just wow. Thank you.
Thank you. It means so much coming from you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. We talk about leaders. Jamuna Jaya exemplifies many of these qualities, so many of them actually. So we honestly speaking, I can say that. Genuinely. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Haribo. Any other?
Andrea.
Andrea, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, Hare Krishna, Anushama Prabhu. Thank you so much. As soon as I realized that you were the teacher for today, I was like rushing to sit down and be able to take notes because I knew this was going to be one of those classes where I was just going to be desperately trying to write everything. Because I love how you always mix the Shastra with such practical ways to look at the world, because I find, I don't know if I'm the only one, but I a lot of times, there'll be these classes where people are speaking about Shastra and it's so like inspiring, but it feels like it's up here. And it's really hard for me to sometimes find a way to pull it down and make it practical and have it sit in my heart. And and that whole like embodied learning that you were talking about, like just having it be there. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know if I'm getting confused.
Yeah, of course.
But and I find this is also practical because a lot of times there was that leadership conference that was this weekend. Did you give the workshop at that conference? Because this sounds like what they were talking about there. I wasn't there, but I read the article on ISKCON News.
No, I was not giving that, but I did hear about it. I did hear about it. Yeah.
It sounds exactly like what they shared in the ISKCON News, a little picture of what people, just based on like the leaders that were there, what they have been feeling that ISKCON is kind of being and what they envision ISKCON being. And I kid you not, Prabhu, it's like what your little screenshot was of the spiritual leadership versus the ego.
Oh, wow.
And so I recommend checking that out because
I will
you got your finger on something and it's there. And and I'm not gonna keep going because I'm just so inspired and I could just talk forever, but I really appreciate what you've shared just for me personally in terms of the seva that I do, but also just giving a perspective of how to see the communities, the spiritual communities around us, and maybe understanding when we do feel unheard and when we feel like we're not connected, why that's happening and where that could be. So thank you so much.
Anytime. Thank you for your enthusiasm in listening. It makes it easier for me to wanting to come on. Even last time when I came on, really appreciated your engagement. Thank you. And yes, like you mentioned, these are very important points, and I think that it's so important because our communities can flourish more and thrive. What we talked about versus just surviving, and it's very important for our spiritual communities, not just for ourselves but our communities to continue to embody these many of these principles. And luckily I'm grateful that many of our communities do, especially the Bhakti Center. I know so many members of the community embody these principles and are working on these principles actively, because we're all working on things and we're all imperfect, but definitely grateful for that. Thank you. Any other comments, any thoughts, any questions? Thank you, Himangi. Thank you for that. I'm just looking at the chat briefly.
I have a question, Anuj Prabhu. Can I?
Of course.
Thank you. Beautiful presentation. Wonderful. So sometimes we can find ourselves being a leader and being very meaningful and seeking meaningful connections and trying to serve others, trying to show empathy, compassion, curiosity, vulnerability, and try to be inclusive and focusing on encouraging others, holding people accountable in a lighthearted way, respecting people. But then if that's not, and sometimes we are forgetting that, forgetting about Krishna, to cut long story short, we're trying, and sometimes those leaders in the material world, they may seem very inclusive and very compassionate, but if Krishna is not in the picture, if that's not provoking spontaneous attraction for devotional service, then that so-called spiritual leadership that may seem very inclusive and compassionate and progressive on the outside, it's just useless. It's as bad as ego-based leadership, So what's your comment on that?
Thank you for your point there. Well, I would say that I would argue that's not useless. just respectfully, I would say that, meaning that it's still valuable to some extent. But absolutely both, the combination of, this is why we talk about spiritual understanding, and what the word that Shukadeva Goswami uses, that because you have an attraction to hearing about Krishna, and Prabhupada writes that, translates that as, because you have an attraction, because your intelligence is fixed in spiritual understanding, then because of this, you are certainly great, basically. You're a great leader, and it's very sublime. And so I think absolutely the combination of doing some of this work, and then also cultivating bhakti and cultivating a deep spiritual understanding, it's really like an unbeatable combination, I feel. And I think both are very important. And Krishna is certainly like the one in front of the zero, if you will, right? In that regard. I would say that still it's inclusive leadership is better than nothing or terrible leadership, because having worked in the corporate space for a number of years, I've seen a number of good leaders and I've seen a number of not so good leaders as well, and I can see the effects it has on people. But I would say that it's still valuable. But I definitely agree with your point that when we add in Krishna, when we add in the bhakti element, we add in devotional service, sometimes it gets really missed, and really adding in that element, because these are all concepts unless they're actually practiced in service, because service is action and service comes from the heart. And so unless we're practicing them, to your point, and even as leaders, unless we're really practicing them, and leaders are really practicing them, then it's a little, so it kind of goes from there. Does that answer your question or your point?
Yeah, it does. And I apologize for using the strong language. It's just the verse that's been on my mind. Srimad Bhagavatam 1-8. The occupational activities a man performs according to his own position are only so much useless labor if they do not provoke attraction for the message of the personality of Godhead. So it's just the wording that's been on my mind. It's definitely, I see your point.
Yes, in the grand scheme, for sure. I mean, that's very important. Yes. Thank you,
Andrea.
I just wanted to share with my invisible husband that is here. This point really, he doesn't feel comfortable sharing in the video, but I wanted to share. He said that one of the things he thinks is that at least if you have ego-based leadership, there's no chance to have Krishna in the conversation or have him there at all. But if you have spiritual-based leadership, even if they don't explicitly have Krishna in the center, at least there's more of an opportunity to invite Krishna in and to kind of have Krishna be there at some point. But with the ego-based, like, forget it. There's just no chance of that. Yeah. So I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, that is a good point, and that's what I mean by when you have certain levels of inclusive leadership, that's still valuable. It's still a value. It's very valuable in itself, because it allows an environment for people. Because sometimes what happens is, and this is a whole different topic, but and I don't mean to trigger anyone here, but having grown up in the movement, also as well, and growing up in the Bhakti path, sometimes I have seen both sides of this leadership coin. And sometimes when leaders are in an ego-based model, it actually can, and there's Krishna consciousness involved, sometimes people can get fried out by that as well. And then they can start to doubt actually the actual path and the essence of bhakti as well. And we see this happens. And being very honest, it does happen. So I think that having both is, like I mentioned, is an unbeatable combination, because being able to keep Krishna in the center, but then also having an environment that's fostering openness and inclusivity and healthy relationships and healthy leadership, etc., is very, very important. And that combined is just very beautiful. And then the beauty of Krishna consciousness and the beauty of practicing bhakti yoga can be felt, actually. It's not necessarily like a drag, but it's an opportunity and a privilege to do it, versus, oh man, I'm just trying to do this and I don't feel so inspired right now, etc. Cool.
Yeah, it's like Srila Prabhupada would always say to people who weren't necessarily open to Krishna consciousness, he would always say, just theoretically try to think that this is coming from Krishna, that Krishna is God. Then this way, if you theoretically understand, then later on realization may come. that's to Andrea's point, how an inclusive leadership does a better chance of bringing Krishna into the mix, as opposed to authoritarian style of leadership. And just wanted to quickly see if you could comment on something that I've been thinking of. Sometimes we get so inclusive and so compassionate that we don't get anything done, and there's no one in charge, and the temple is just a mess. So sometimes strong leadership, does the strong leadership, let's put it this way, does strong leadership have place in the movement?
Absolutely. So that's why, and that's a good point. But that's why I mentioned with humility, it gets a bad rap as just being passive, right? Being passive and tolerant of everyone. And sometimes we take these principles and we really run with them 100 miles an hour, but we're not also seeing sometimes the other side of it, right? So humility doesn't mean us being passive and just being totally tolerant of anything and just mean to be humble, but it means, like I mentioned, being confident and also being assertive as necessary. And as also mentioned in the chart that I done, that also holding people accountable. It's not just about encouraging and appreciating. It's holding also people accountable for some of the ways that maybe they're not showing up, or holding ourselves accountable. So I think both things are important. The problem is when we can't do one or the other, right? Like when we're not able to do both, and we only do one or the other. So we're either just passive or we're just aggressive. We're not able to be assertive, right? And often we're not taught how to be assertive, but also how to be compassionate. It's an art, right? It needs to be really cultivated, and it takes a lot of practice. Believe it or not, it's not just something we can talk about and say, oh, this is a concept. It needs to be practiced and fine-tuned in relationships and experimented with, and how that works. But both are absolutely necessary, because humility as just passivity, people can take advantage. People can, like you said, there can be lack of structure, it can be lack of accountability, and that's not good for the organization, for other people as well. So being assertive is very important, but it's also knowing not to be too aggressive, right? Sometimes there's 3 levels of communication: passive, assertive, aggressive. Most people are either passive or aggressive, or sometimes passive aggressive, right? But we haven't learned how to be actually assertive, because we're not taught that sometimes in our families, in our societies, in our schools. We're not necessarily taught assertive communication. So I think both are important. Like, to your point, being strong absolutely has its place, but sometimes we're strong all the time, right? Which is not good. Sometimes we're weak, or we're feeling passive all the time. That's also not good. And so being able to balance being assertive while also being compassionate and gentle is an art. It's a balance.
Beautiful. You have to give us a workshop on that, to give it a chance to practice.
I'm
Okay,
still working on it
D&D.
too, but absolutely.
D&D, and followed by Susan. Susan, thank you so much.
D&D, yes.
D&D is Devaki Nandan Das. So,
Haribo.
Haribo. Thank you so much, Anuj, for expressing your heart. One example coming in my mind about a great leader is Shri Hanumanji. He's the greatest devotee of Lord Ram. So he wanted to learn this wisdom of leadership, and he found out that sun god has the best wisdom that sun is offering. So he went to sun god. He said, I want to learn everything from you. And sun god said, I have millions of sages in the line, so I'm not sure if I can give you a place in this class. And I'm moving. I'm always on the move. So Hanumanji said, no problem. I will move with you, and I will sit behind these millions of sages, but I want to learn from you. So he learned this greatest science of the Vedic wisdom from sun god. And then he asked for donation. What can I give you back? So sun god said, nothing much. But when you go on this planet Earth, there is a monkey called Sugriv, and he doesn't have much wisdom. He's not so powerful. I want you to serve him. He's also my disciple. So I felt that Hanumanji He was millions of times more powerful than Sugriv. He was millions of times more wise than Sugriv. But he became kind of servant of Sugriv. So it's a great example of showing what actually leadership is supposed to be. So Hanumanji is supposed to be the king of the monkeys of the whole Kishkinda region. But he made, first Vali was the king, then Sugriv, he made Sugriv the king. He never became the king. And our gurus tell us that yes, Vali and Sugriv became the king, the leaders of all the millions of monkeys. But Hanumanji became the king of the hearts of the monkeys. He owned the hearts of all these millions of monkeys. They loved him much, much more than Sugriv and Vali, because his purity. This wonderful Vaishnava was mentioning Krishna's hand in the spiritual leadership. So his humility was surcharged with Rama Bhakti. He was such a devotional bhakta of Lord Ram that Lord Ram and Mother Sita blessed him to actually own the hearts of all these monkeys. So I just wanted to share that great example of a leader of Hanumanji. Thank you so much, Anuj.
Yeah, thank you. No, absolutely. Hanuman is one of the top leaders for sure. And like you mentioned, to your point, his behavior also endeared him to the other folks in the other monkeys, and how he also was serving. We talked about, even in another we were talking about service, right? And really keeping Krishna in the center. But his service attitude was second to none, really. So I think that those are both great points in terms of what made him a leader as well. Okay, so thank you. Susan, was there a question you said from Susan? I think you're on mute, Susan.
Susan, you're muted.
I just wanted to really appreciate your entire talk. I mean, starting from your sharing your definition of humility, that it's coming from the earth, and that we have to be so grounded, ending with your amazing point about needing introspection, getting help, and being the light that we are. There's so much to learn, and this was just so inspiring. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for that. Really appreciate that. And I'm so glad it was valuable. And speaking of getting help, speaking of Hanuman, there's such a nice example of Jambavan and Hanuman, where Hanuman forgot his powers, but because of the mentorship of someone else, he was able to remember how much of a leader he was actually. So he had forgot. So that definitely, that point of getting help is so important. Thank you, Susan. Appreciate that. Any last thoughts as we jump off? I know we are at time. And thank you for everyone in the chat. I see Karthik. Thank you so much. Julia and Preeti, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anuj. Prabhu. Beautiful presentation, very practical. See, it provoked many, many questions. That means the talk was good. Thank you very much, everyone, for reflecting, asking a question, commenting, chatting. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Don't be passive, don't be aggressive. Be assertive and be kind, and keep Krishna in the center. Like Anuj Prabhu shared with us today. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Come back tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anand Bihar Prabhu, for having me, and Bhakti Center for having me. Very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll see you next time, Prabhu.
Hari Bol, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.